to understand why the reforms were necessary, I think you need to understand what the House was like in those days, how power was distributed, what it was like as a place to work. In those days, the Democrats were nominally in control in the majority, but the House was often dominated by the conservative coalition, Republicans and largely Southern Democrats. So these reforms were born out of policy frustration. That was a powerful driver for those reforms. And also a personal unhappiness. One of the main reasons is simply that a lot of the people who ran the House in those days were arrogant, arbitrary, and insufferable, and that was on a good day. Now, I know our focus is supposed to be the reforms of 1974, but as Charlie has indicated, a number of them they were actually passed in 72 and not implemented until 1974. The agenda of those reforms was largely set by Dick Bowling in two books that he wrote, Power in the House and House Out of Order. The theme of those reforms was simply that we needed to rein in the unaccountable power centers, the unelected committee chairman, and we needed to strengthen the accountable elected party leadership. Now, those reforms have been questioned through the years by some people who say that they made it harder for the leadership to get things done. I think that criticism is off the mark. It made it harder for committee chairmen to get things done, but it enhanced the power of party leaders vis-a-vis committee chairs, which was our intention. There were other changes. One of the most important was to institute roll calls during the amendment stage in the committee of the whole. Before that change, when you were debating the bill in the amending process, you could not get a roll call vote. If you passed on a standing vote or on a teller vote, if you passed an amendment on the floor, then often the chairman of the committee, when they went back on the House floor, they could then get a re-vote on that amendment, and that would be a roll call vote. But that's the only time you had a roll call vote in the amending process. The reforms changed that, and that change meant, on the positive side, that the public could figure out what their representative had voted for and voted against. That was the positive result. The negative side, which I think was more important, is that it gave every single issue group in the country the power to push their pet amendment, get a vote on it, and then turn it into a 30-second gotcha TV ad in the next campaign. And campaign committee chairmen for the caucuses could do the same thing. So some would pine today for the good old days of open rules, but understand in those days, open rules meant nothing because you could not get a roll call vote during that so-called open rule process. And so I think it's important for people to understand that. There were other changes that we made as well. As Charlie mentioned, I chaired the commission which tried to reorganize the House administratively and which also wound up modernizing the code of ethics. We put limits on outside income because of conflict of interest. We reduced and then eliminated honoraria, so members could no longer go down to a breakfast with a special interest group, collect a $1,000 speaking fee, and then be voting on their legislation a few hours later. So the biggest change, which I think produced the worst result, was the 1974 Budget Act, and I know Don will laugh when I say this, but the best thing about the Budget Act is that it gave Congress greater ability to challenge the executive branch with independent analysis by creating the Congressional Budget Office. The worst thing is that it totally screwed up the ability of Congress to do the one thing it has to do each year, which is to complete action on appropriation bills. It has made budgeting far more political and far more partisan and far easier to game, It's made the process far less real because it's largely based on estimates that are easily phonied up. One last point. I think it's important to understand how legislatures need to work to be most effective. The way I see it, the role of party leadership is to lay out for the committee chairs and for the committees as a whole where the leadership wants to go. And then their wishes need to be leavened by the knowledge that individual committees and individual committee members have picked up through the years, so that you can modify the leadership recommendations so that they will survive their first contact with political reality. That's the way it's supposed to work. But if the leadership allows the budget committee to produce numbers which are overly optimistic or unrealistic, then you run into trouble and you face impending disaster each year. If the leadership does not have the technical knowledge or the substantive knowledge, then you have to have the fallback of the committees that are supposed to know the most about those issues, so that you have a balance between the leadership's obligation to push for what they believe in and the committee's obligation to make those packages reasonable by listening to people who may have spent 20 or 30 years learning the ropes in their field.
The 70 Reorganization Act. Why was it created? In large measure because there were winds of change blowing inside the Congress and outside the Congress. You had incoming freshmen, even at that time, knew that the place needed reform. Probably one of the most powerful statements was a little quip I saw, not a quip so much, but a statement by, if you remember, Allard Lowenstein, Democrat of New York. And he said, just after serving about 3 or 4 months as a newcomer in '69, mentioned that Congress is like the black hole of Calcutta. Nothing prepares you for its horrors. Plus, you had large numbers of members who really wanted change. You know, in '69, you had 200 measures, either sponsored or co-sponsored, on legislative reform issues. So this was sort of the context in which a lot of the changes were made. Now, what did the 1970 reorganization actually do? Just in terms of some major themes, and then I'll move on to the Democratic caucus with an interlude with a couple of comments that I want to make. One of the objectives, which was to curb and hedge and constrain the power of the committee chairs. And the idea was to do this through rules changes. So one of the ways it was done was to require all standing committees in the House and the Senate to create written rules, and all regular meeting days and so on the idea that if the chairs were abusing their power, at least you had an opportunity now for the members of that committee to make some adjustments or changes in the rules to control that. Secondly, it strengthened the analytical capacities available to the Congress, and also, as indicated by Charlie, provided more procedural information to the lawmakers of the House of Representatives. On the analytical information side, the Comptroller General was given more authority, and the place I work, then and now, the Legislative Reference Service, as it was called in '68, had its name changed to the Congressional Research Service, plus given additional policy analysis responsibilities for the Congress. Now, in some of these changes I mentioned, there were reversals by the Democratic caucus. And then the last point I would make on this was the issue that Mr. Obey raised, the whole issue of transparency. In fact, I would argue that the age of 1970, that decade, was the age of transparency for the Congress in terms of a lot of things that it did, from electronic voting to C-SPAN starting in 1979. But in terms of probably the most significant, perhaps, was the requirement for recorded teller votes in the Committee of the Whole. And the sponsors of that were an amendment it was bipartisan, by Tip O'Neill and Charles Gupzer, Republican of California, were the co-sponsors of that. I'm not sure whether or not the energy and momentum for reform was dissipating or not, but it was certainly accelerated when the class of 1974 was elected. 75 new Democrats elected to the House of Representatives in the wake of Watergate. Huge election. And this class was different in a whole lot of ways in terms of the kind of energy they had, their independence, their pragmatism, their anti-establishment views, their commitment to reform, smart people. And they were different. They were called a new breed. So what did this class do? Well, probably the most dramatic thing that happened, and they did a lot of things for sure, was they organized themselves as a class group, elected officers, planned what it is that they wanted to do, and of course, they were elected, breathing smoke and fire, if you will, to change the institution of the House of Representatives, particularly this seniority system and the power of committee chairs. To end, the place was transformed in this roughly 1970 to 1975 period, not only in terms of the internal configuration of power, even in legislative executive challenges and relationships with the War Powers Resolution and anything else. So small things, incrementally it was done, start the caucus, and you move forward to really adopt and create consequential developments involving power distribution in the chamber.
So I thought I would provide some wrap-up discussion of the rules and institutional changes we've been talking about to put the reforms of the 70s into this context. First, talk about reforms that had their intended effects, but second, also reforms that might have produced unintended or at least unanticipated consequences. So first, on the goal of making the House more responsive to the policy views of its majority, particularly in a period of an emerging liberal majority within the Democratic caucus. How do reformers achieve that? We've talked mostly about these already, so just briefly. First, loosening the grip of committee chairs on the agenda and on policy outcomes. We've talked about sunshine reforms, opening meetings, recorded votes in the Committee of the Whole, electronic voting. In 1974, Walter mentioned the Subcommittee Bill of Rights, including some sweeteners to get minority party Republicans to vote for those reforms. So how do reformers really achieve that intended effect? First, the opening up, the loosening grip of committees. But second, as we've talked about, empowering the party caucus, making chairs stand for re-election, and more generally, making the caucus the locus of decision-making. So power devolved pretty quickly below committees to subcommittees, as well as above committees to the caucus, which I think of as a nice reminder of something Norm Ornstein wrote very long ago about institutional change in the House and in Congress. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game, right? That we have two new sources of internal House power emerging with the reforms. And those do appear to be the intended effects of the reformers. So first, that first goal, making the House and its processes and its outcomes more responsive. But the second goal, empowering Congress with its relations with the Nixon administration and with the executive more broadly. We've talked about fiscal policy in terms of the Congressional Budget Act, although Mr. Obey's comments make me think that perhaps I should be putting the Budget Act in the list of reforms with unintended consequences in their interaction with appropriations. We might also want to put in this category of reforms intending to empower Congress the war policy and the War Powers Resolution, bridging that chasm between the president's rights, power as commander-in-chief and Congress's power of the purse to commit troops. We could argue forever now whether or not the War Powers Resolution actually had its intended effect. I'm not so sure, but it certainly, at a minimum, laid down the markers for when and why, under what conditions the president should be consulting with Congress over the commitment of troops abroad. So fiscal policy, a clear effect. War policy, I would also add in monetary policy, I think a bit underappreciated when we think about the 1970s and what difference an emerging liberal majority had in shaping the economy. Congress imposed new reporting requirements on the Fed, new audits. Most importantly, it wrote for the very first time an explicit mandate into the Federal Reserve Act about what Congress expected the Fed to do, right, to care both about jobs and growth as well as about prices and inflation. Just briefly to wrap up then, unintended consequences. There were probably several. I would point to just one here for us to think about, and that would be the impact of sunshine rules on the House, and particularly on the House floor. which obviously transparency has obviously much to speak for itself, and we've talked about the ways in which transparency transformed the House. The ability to request a recorded vote on amendments committee of the whole, the advent of electronic voting. But there are also, I think, some unintended consequences that accompanied those reforms. As we all know, conditions start to change, parties begin to polarize, right? We see more partisan voting in the 80s and 90s. We see the advent then of restrictive rules, decisions by party leaders to use the rules to pursue the caucus's policy priorities. Again, all in a chain of events that got unleashed by creating the floor as an avenue or an arena for actually making policy decisions, for opening up, making much broader participation within the floor. It precipitates this chain of events. I think these changes rooted in the 70s are an important reminder about the power of institutional reform and about the power of reformers to actually make a difference, to improve the legislative branch. Certainly the 1970s is a testament to the success of the reformers in building sustainable coalitions in favor of change. At the same time, I think these 1970s reforms are a good reminder about the limits of institutional reform. That is, the House and Senate rules outlast, right, both the coalitions that put them into place and the political conditions that made those reforms possible. And that is inevitably, right, a recipe for having unanticipated or unintended consequences of reform, which can be good or bad for the institution, but either way, very hard to undo once those reforms get layered into place.